Hello and welcome to SASSI, Socially Active Single Souls Mimics. The topic for this episode is first dates, including tips, ideas, worst dates, and first date recovery. My name is Kara and I am your host. Prior to getting started, I would like to offer a warm invitation to you to visit SASSI.ca. From there you can send in your stories, or you can send in your shared experiences as stories that can be read and recorded as an episode. I promise you will be well cared for and we will explore together these adventures that we call dating. Foremost on this topic of first dates, I think it's important to state that the chances of a first date ending up in a match or a meaningful long-term relationship are not, in fact, actually that strong. Love at first sight, immediate connections are rare, but they do happen. However, it is important to understand that the first date is necessary, and that it is the beginning of many steps or many forks in the road ahead that will determine from that point whether that relationship will be meaningful and or long-term. So why are you having a first date in the first place? Largely because you've already done the work to establish a connection. Prior to this first date, you've made contact, identified common interests. You feel that there is something mutual in the way that you communicate, in your past experiences, in your future goals and aspirations. So what is the energy going into this first date? Are there still a lot of unanswered questions? Is there a mystery yet to be unraveled with regard to the information that you've already gathered from this potential person? Are you excited about the connection? Of course, most people are nervous, but hopefully there's some excitement, that it's not just a dry run. A lot of people don't pause long enough to ask themselves, ask their soul how they feel about this first date, trying to connect intuitively to what is already there, what is the potential, what are some of the red flags. It is important going into this first date that you don't feel too much, but you don't want to feel too little either. Largely what happens in the initial connection stages, when you have sent off that first hello, when they have responded, when you have gathered more than just one sentence phrases from their cell phone as they rush through the day, that something happened that you felt was a genuine connection. Something was said, something was felt. Now the first date is to find out if the impressions that you got are real. Is the person themselves representing themselves as real? It's like painting a canvas. Is the canvas as advertised? What happens with our imagination and our feelings as we go into this first date is we've already started to paint that canvas. There's an expression that beware that you're not painting a castle alone. So when you get to this first date, be cautious of what you've already painted on the canvas. Allow the other person the space to paint for themselves. You may, in fact, have to add another base coat of gesso to cover up all your scribblings of emotions and preconceived ideas and start from scratch. But that's the beauty of the first date. For as much as you think you know, there's still a lot of unexpected things, and a lot of good unexpected things. Because sometimes, as an artist, we may not be the best at interpreting what people say as compared to how they behave. Assuming, of course, that you've already telephoned each other, you've had a couple conversations prior to the first date. Don't let it go any longer than that, however, because the longer that you go before you meet this person, the more intricate that painting becomes. And then you have to gesso or base coat over the whole thing and start again. Sometimes you might blame them for painting that you created. Now, there are some pretty basic first date tips out there. You can find them on a lot of websites. I do not agree with all of them, so I've given you somewhat of a short list. Safety is, of course, first. Pick a location, let someone know where you're going, find your own transportation, let somebody know when you'll be back. In fact, give them some coordinates of the individual, their name, their phone number, their email. I'm not predicting worst case scenario, but these are just wise tips to follow. Don't overcomplicate things. When I was in university, one of the first dates that I went on to with a fellow student was a guy I had met very briefly, spoken to on the phone very briefly. Because we belonged to the same university campus, I didn't spend a lot of time getting to know him prior to meeting him. When we did meet, he brought gifts, several gifts in fact. He brought a painting. He brought a recording of Glenn Gould, which I appreciated because I never knew the artist. But I ended up carrying these gifts, literally and figuratively, through the date. I felt overwhelmed by these tokens. I felt a little bit paid for, if I can say that. And I know that was not the intention, but it was cumbersome, made me feel uncomfortable. It was unnecessary, and it was too much. It was overcomplicated, even before we got started. Try not to stress unnecessarily. Keep it casual. Don't put too much pressure on yourself. This is where it comes down to that painting again, where you've built up imagery and building castles before you've met the person. Some websites suggest that you prepare first date topics. Nah, can't do that. It's too scripted. I believe if you try to then introduce these topics, that you may stumble over yourself to appear genuine. The most important thing to do when it comes to having things to talk about is the equal give and take that transpires in the conversation. You have to be as free to ask questions and to answer questions. But at the same time, you don't want to rely on small talk. You have to be prepared within that very equal give and take to express some deeper sentiments, some more textured truths, without giving everything away. It's okay to express that you have needs. That's a Pandora's box. Be careful. I don't literally mean needs. But express some of the things that you're looking for. Expressing needs without being needy. Of course, try to stay away from politics. That will come in time, but not on a first date. A person wants to meet you and the foundation of you, which generally means your soul and your stories. You could ask them what keeps them busy. What do they do for fun? When I was visiting in Germany, I had been informed very specifically from my friends there that it was inappropriate for me to continue to ask people what they did for a living. And that struck me as rather strange because in my mind I was being hospitable. They said, what you do for a living is not always a choice. A lot of people take employment because it's necessary, get into a career because they become bracketed into that choice over a series of education and student loans. So try to stick to asking them what they like to do rather than what they do for a living. Other than being your true self, one of the things that requires a bit of intentional attention is your ability to listen. Now, some dates recommend that you go as far as what's called mirroring, as in you're going to mirror your partner in the tone that they use in the voice, the pacing or speed at which they speak, maybe even some of their gestures. Again, I find this disingenuous, but there is something that can be gleaned from this mirroring exercise, and that is if you're listening and observing them for some of their gestures and their pacing, their expressions, whether they tend to have a silly tone or a serious tone, that allows you to be more present and appear more interested. When a person feels that you are listening, they are bound to share more. That doesn't mean you're going to stay in the realm of listening for the whole date. Again, that equal measure of give and take is very important. Respect personal boundaries. That means their boundaries and your boundaries. Many recommendations include the ever important have fun. Of course, we all want to have fun, but not at the expense of our date, not at the expense of ourselves, but to be open enough to be silly. What does it mean exactly to have fun? Having fun is probably why people have more opportunities of meeting other people once they've had a drink or two. I'm not suggesting you have a drink or two. I'm only saying that the nature of having a drink or two is generally related to letting your guard down and having less barriers up. One of the things that is nice to find out early in the dating process is your date partner's past history of dating. And generally, this does occur quite often in the first date. So, frame your single situation positively. Highlight all of the things that you currently enjoy about being single. Put more emphasis on that. It is honest to explain what things you don't like about being single, but don't make that the concentration of your expose. Don't spill your guts. Be brief about your exes, and be positive about your future. Flirting is always a good skill if you have it. If you don't, just rely on compliments. Giving compliments is the early stage of flirting. Now, while you can't control chemistry or compatibility or attraction, you can make sure that you are at least mentally ready so that if they happen, you're prepared for it in that most positive and delicious way that it can happen, but to also be prepared if it doesn't happen. With respect to chemistry and compatibility not happening, doesn't mean it won't happen. It might mean that you need another date if you're still unsure, if you haven't been completely turned off. But you know on your first date you're going to spend a basic amount of time, kind of an hour at minimum. If the connection and chemistry doesn't happen, if your date is rude, obnoxious, doesn't know their boundaries, talks too much, doesn't talk enough, you may have to abort mission. So you might have to figure out how you're going to leave that date. The easiest way to do that is to simply say, "I'm sorry, I can't stay." You're not saying, "I'm sorry, I have to leave." You're just phrasing it as, "I'm sorry, I can't stay." Sounds more positive. Practice it if you have to, but be prepared to leave the first date on a good tone. Let them know that you will contact them tomorrow. This is very important, one way or the other, whether you have an intention of continuing on from the first date or not. The next message that you will leave the following day will determine the next step. You will either A, be letting them know that you are interested in doing some other activity, or B, letting them know that you're not interested. Now, when you've done that mirroring from earlier on in your date and you've observed them, there should be lots of information there that you can share with your first date partner as positive characteristics that will be paired with the information that you don't in fact wish to continue dating. So sandwich in the message of not interested with "thank you for all of these things that you brought on our date," and be specific from the positive things you noticed in them while you were on your date. So along the theme of having fun, the most important thing to do as a single soul on a first date is to decide what activity you're going to do. Most dating sites will recommend a coffee, and ironically enough, that is not something I'm going to recommend, and here's the reasons why. When you go for a coffee, you're likely in a public space, great for safety, but not for intimacy. You're going to be sitting very likely across from each other in a forced interview position. When you're not looking at your date across the table, there's usually not much else in a coffee shop to look at except for the other patrons, which can be uncomfortable in itself. And I don't know if you've ever been in a coffee shop and seen two people arrive who are on their first date, and by the body language, you can tell immediately the awkwardness of a first date. So, the coffee part is a good idea, not necessarily the coffee shop itself. Unless, of course, like some of our local coffee places, they offer other things to do while you're having coffee. And one of those is a coffee house that offers activities while you're there. Could be a board game, could be a puzzle, could be a craft, but these do exist. And if coffee shops want to expand their clientele, highly recommend that they keep up with this trend. Now, prior to giving you the list of different activities that you can do for a first date, which will be listed in the show notes, and also at the end of the podcast for the listening audience who may exclusively be on an audio platform without access to show notes. But before that, I'd like to give you the top ranking idea for a first date, and that is a picnic. I know that it's weather dependent, but you can be creative. You could always meet at a park with your separate vehicles, but sit in one vehicle. This way you get to learn a little bit about the person, especially if you have agreed to both bring food that you have prepared. You get to share a little bit of your flavors and your tastes, and it indirectly ensures that both of you have put in a little bit of an effort prior to getting to the first date. There's always something else to look at than just each other, meaning the scenery. It imprints a more positive experience because nature has a way of doing that. And it gives you an opportunity not to be looking at each other directly. And that's why also, to reiterate, that having a coffee and walking is also not the most ideal first date. Because in the walking scenario, you have, contrary to too much eye contact, you have very little eye contact. Now, my first worst date that became my best first date is a difficult story to tell. I met Richard, but I did not know of him personally because he was part of an elite parachute team and I worked in a different department. Richard, or Rick, had noticed me from a distance and got my attention and invited me out to an event that involved this elite parachute team, and it was their year-end awards ceremony evening, somewhat of a gala event. And I was, initially and rightfully intrigued by the fact that he was handsome and fit and part of this elite team, and there was an awards night and it was a gala, and I thought, what could go wrong? But I never felt so invisible on a first night as I did that night, because I didn't know these individuals. And an awards ceremony, if you've been to any of them, can be long, and if you don't even understand what is required to earn some of these awards, it just was streaming over my head. And Rick was obviously very well liked, and he received an award himself, and I felt even more invisible. And that's on the tail of getting prepared to go on a date with someone I really did not know. There weren't any pre-conversations. There wasn't any getting to know him prior to the event itself. He showed up in an expensive rental car, and we went to the gala. The only reason I felt safe doing that was because the organization that we worked for has a lot of security levels, and we wouldn't be in that organization if we didn't already pass the security litmus test. So as part of that evening, I actually left the event at some point. I felt intimidated by this individual who was getting all of this recognition, and I didn't know how to fit into that. I didn't know what to say, and I'm not generally a shy person. Neither do I have a weak ego, so I wasn't hurt as much as I was just not in my element. So I chose to move to a different pub that was located at the hotel where the gala was taking place. And I passed part of the evening in that pub and was actually having a pretty good time, making new friends and enjoying myself for the moment. Eventually, Rick noticed that I wasn't there, and eventually he found me. And when he did find me, I wasn't upset and I wasn't hurt. I was just dealing with the fact that I was out of my element, and I was actually quite capable of explaining that to him without making him feel uncomfortable, because that was the last thing that I wanted to do. Because I was able to communicate with him, because I was able not to be hurt and not to be angry, and because I was able to find my own way and find my own positive path in that evening, established something between Rick and I, which led to our next date, which was then, in fact, more of a first date. And from that basis of honesty and communication, we established one of the most meaningful relationships that I've ever had in my life. And that wasn't just a first date, it was my first love. As it happens, several months from that moment in time, Rick was killed by being hit head-on by a drunk driver. I contemplated whether to share this story, and after much prayer and meditation, I felt it was important to share with you, because I wanted you to know that whatever loss that you've gone through, whether it's through death, divorce, or distance, that you can still find love. And also in sharing that story with you, to encourage you that our stories are what connect us, our stories are what help us learn, and when we share those stories, we help others learn. So again, I extend the warm invitation to go to SASSI.ca, share your stories, I'll read them for you, or you can be a guest on my podcast and establish whatever level of anonymity that you choose, and we can share our stories together. I would love to hear the stories of your best and worst dates. So I'm signing off, and I'm asking you all to be curious. My name is Kara, and I am the host of Sassy. So here's the list. Performance at a park, a bike ride. I have yet to try an electric bike, and if I can rent one with a first date, that would be pretty exciting. An arcade, a beach day, going to have your tarot cards read, a board game, bowling, museum, a thrift shop, always a good one. Go to a thrift shop, agree that you're going to spend $5 on each other and see what comes of it. Attend a book reading, a farmer's market. Go just for dessert, meaning pick up the dessert for your picnic. An open house, a pedicure, an art class, a comedy show, a bookstore. You could make a game of the bookstore. First impressions, worst impressions. Make each book that you pick a story from the past or the future, hopes and regrets. You could go to a new neighborhood. You could volunteer for something. Go to a historical house tour. Take a lesson together. Now, taking a lesson together or investing serious money into a first date really depends on the depth of that first connection that was made through the communication and the phone calls prior to dating. You could have a new food experience. Try something like Korean or some flavor that you haven't tried before. Find a view, an ocean, a mountain view, a vista, anything that creates the ambiance and the memory of that wonderful first date. You could go for a whale tour, watch a junior sports competition, go to an art gallery, go to an auction, and both agree that you're going to put $20 into something and see if you can get something out of the auction for $20. Rock climbing, horse riding, mini golf, and any of those outdoor adventure parks. If there are ideas that you have tried as first dates and were complete failures, feel free to leave a comment. If you've had first dates which were absolutely stellar, please leave a comment. I would love to hear what creative ways people have invented to build on that first date experience.